Every August, my phone lights up with the same message. My roses are dying. What did I do wrong? And every August, I tell those gardeners the same thing. You did nothing wrong, and your rose is not dying. That bush standing there full of green leaves and stingy with flowers is protecting itself on purpose. And left alone, it will come roaring back. But a handful of real problems hide in that very border, and each one turns into a 30-second job the moment you learn to read it. The mechanism behind it is simpler than it looks. Once the daytime temperature climbs past the mid-80s and settles into the 90s, a rose changes what it is working on. In spring, with mild days and cool nights, that bush pours everything into flowers. In a heat wave, it does the opposite. It pulls energy back from blooming and spends it on staying alive, moving water up to the leaves faster than the roots can draw it from the dry soil. The flowers that do open come out smaller, the color washes pale, and the deep reds and purples can crisp brown at the edges because dark petals soak up more heat than light ones. Some buds simply drop before they open, and a fair number of varieties will stop flowering altogether, sitting there as a bush of green foliage and nothing else, until the weather finally breaks. That has a name. Growers call it heat-induced dormancy, a summer version of the deep rest your roses take in winter. None of it is damage or defeat. It runs on the same instinct that lets a rose survive a 100-degree afternoon and still be standing in October when many softer plants have given up. You will even see the foliage go limp and wilted during the fiercest midday sun before perking back up on its own by evening, which is the plant conserving moisture rather than any sign of trouble. I had a client, a lovely woman in her 70s named Margaret, who called me one August in a real panic, certain the prize rose by her front steps had died overnight. It had not died, it was napping. 3 weeks later, when the nights finally dropped back into the 60s, that same bush was covered in blooms, so rich and full she took a photo and framed it. Cooler nights are exactly what a rose is waiting for, because cool nights are when petals fill out, color deepens, and fragrance comes back. So the first fix, and it is the hardest one for a good gardener to swallow, is to do almost nothing. If your rose is stalled in a heat wave, leave it be, water it deeply and early, lay down a thick mulch to cool the root zone and hold moisture, give it a little afternoon shade if you can, and let it ride out the weather on its own schedule. Fussing with it now does more harm than good, but that only covers the plant protecting itself. The rest of what you are seeing is a set of specific, fixable problems hiding in the same bed, and all any of them asks for is a clean pair of snips and a few seconds of attention. Let me walk you through them the way I would if we were standing at your border together, coffee in hand. This is also where variety choice quietly earns its keep. The roses bred for heat, the ones with thick, waxy leaves and deep roots that reach down to cooler soil, sail through a spell that flattens a fussy show rose, and a light-colored bloom holds its shape in the heat far better than a dark one that crisps. If your summers run brutal, that is worth remembering the next time you shop. Start with the one that fools even experienced growers, because the plant looks perfect. You find a cane that is healthy, green, thick, growing fast, covered in good foliage, and at the very tip where a flower bud should be forming, there is nothing. Just a little cluster of leaves and a blunt stub, or a soft bent tip that dried up and quit. That cane is never going to bloom. It is called a blind shoot, and if you have never heard the term, you are in good company, because most rose advice skips right over it. What causes a blind shoot is not fully understood, which is a refreshingly honest thing for a plant book to admit. It shows up most on upright growers like hybrid teas, and it tracks closely with big swings between warm days and cool nights, with too little light in a shady spot, and with a rose that has been fed too hard on nitrogen and pushed into all that lush green growth at the expense of flowers. In a normal year, it will hit maybe 1 cane in 10 across a bush, sometimes more after a rough stretch of weather, and sometimes the cause is even simpler than any of that. A deer or a rabbit nips off the soft growing tip in the night, taking the developing bud with it, and the cane regrows blind while the gardener blames the whole plant. I once spent a long, gloomy afternoon convinced a client's entire bed had picked up some virus, ready to recommend we dig the lot out. It was blind shoots, top to bottom, after a week of hot days and cold nights. I felt like a complete fraud. The fix could not be easier, and this is your first 30-second job. Follow that blind cane down from the tip to the first outward-facing leaf that carries 5 leaflets away from the center of the bush. Snip cleanly just above it with sharp bypass shears. That is all. The plant wakes the bud sitting in that leaf's shoulder and pushes a fresh shoot, and most of the time, roughly 7 of every 10, that second attempt carries a proper flower bud. New wood, new chance. If the shoot is weak and spindly, take it back by as much as a third to force stronger growth. Just be sure you are dealing with a true blind shoot and not a cane that is simply stalled in the heat like everything else in the bed. A blind shoot has finished its tip and closed the door for good. A heat-stalled cane still has a living growing point that will move again when the weather cools. When in doubt, wait a week before you cut. Now for the problem that gets treated wrong more than any other, because the same symptom hides 3 completely different causes, and lumping them together is exactly why people reach for the wrong cure. The picture looks identical every time. A fat, promising bud swells up, gets right to the edge of opening, and just stops. It never unfurls. And what you do about it depends entirely on which of the 3 you are looking at. The first is called balling, and it is a piece of pure physics, not disease. Rain soaks the tightly packed outer petals of a swollen bud. The sun comes out, dries those wet petals fast, and they fuse together into a stiff, papery shell, a kind of straitjacket the flower cannot push through. A thin, slimy film of mold sets in underneath and glues the whole thing shut even tight. It hits hardest in cool, damp, partly shaded spots, especially where a bush gets less than 6 hours of direct sun, and worst of all on roses packed with thin petals, the deep-cupped, globular, many-petaled blooms. Your fat English roses, your old bourbons and centifolias, anything carrying more than 40 petals, the very roses people love most, are the ones most prone to it. Peonies and camellias do the same thing, if that helps you picture it, while the single and semi-double moderns, like the knockout shrubs, rarely ball at all. And here is the part that feels like a magic trick the first time you try it. If you catch a bald bud early, before it turns to mush, you gently peel those fused outer petals off with your thumbnail, like unwrapping something. Most of the time, the flower waiting underneath is untouched and perfect, and it opens on its own within a few hours. I learned this the embarrassing way. I once sprayed a whole bed of David Austin roses for what I was certain were insects, chemical and all, and got nothing for my trouble. The blooms stayed shut. My actual fix was a thumbnail and 4 peeled petals. The spray did nothing, and the peel did everything. To keep balling from happening in the first place, open the bush up with good pruning and generous spacing so air moves through and dries the buds, and in a wet spell you can even prop an umbrella or a bit of tarp over your most precious blooms. So much for the physics, because the second cause of a stuck bud is very much alive. Thrips. These are insects so small, barely a couple of millimeters, that you will look straight at one and see nothing but a fleck of dust. They tuck themselves deep inside the bud, down near the base of the petals, and they rasp away at the soft tissue to drink the sap. Once you know it, the damage is distinctive. The petals come out streaked with silvery white and brown, the edges look ragged and scorched, and the whole bud is distorted, sometimes stuck half open, sometimes never opening at all. Nearby leaves pick up a faint silvery stippling, and you may find tiny black specks of droppings on the petals. They favor pale and white roses most of all. Do the tap test. Bend a suspect bud over your open hand and give it a sharp flick, and if a few specks tumble out and start to move, those are your culprits. Your contact spray keeps missing them because they hide down inside the bud where it never reaches. The good news is that thrips damage is almost entirely cosmetic. The plant itself is fine and recovers on its own. Your move is simply to snip off the worst of the affected buds, keep the weeds and long grass around the bed cut down, since that is where they breed, and let the next flush come in clean. One exception is worth flagging, though. A newer pest called chili thrips behaves nothing like the ordinary kind. It goes after the foliage and new growth across the whole plant, not just the buds, leaving leaves bronzed and scarred, and it can wreck a bush fast, so widespread bronzing rather than a few streaked blooms is a signal to act quickly. The third cause is a true disease, and it is the one you must never peel. This is botrytis, grey mold, and it shows up in mild, damp weather as buds that go brown and speckled and blotchy, then soft and mushy to the touch. Left alone, it can travel down from a rotting bud into the stem and cause the cane to die back. Here is the diagnostic tell that separates all three, so tuck this away. If the browning starts on the outer petals and the bud turns mushy and rotten, you are looking at fungus, botrytis, so cut it off and carry it out of the garden, pruning back to clean, healthy wood. If the damage is on the inner petals, streaked and distorted with a dry, scarred feel, that is thrips. And if it is a dry, papery outer shell you can actually peel away to reveal a healthy flower underneath, that is balling, and that one you rescue. Same stuck bud. 3 different stories, 3 different hands. Sweep up the fallen petals underneath while you are there, because that mushy litter is where the mold lives. Let me take you to the mistake I see most across otherwise careful gardens, and it is a mistake of kindness. You loved that bloom too much to cut it, so you left the spent flower on the cane. And by doing that, without meaning to, you flipped a switch inside the plant. When a rose is allowed to hold on to a faded flower, it begins building a hip, the round seed pod behind the bloom. The moment that hip starts to form, the plant reads it as a message. Job done, seeds are on the way, time to stop making new flowers, finish this batch, and head toward dormancy. On that cane, the bloom signal goes quiet. This is the slow, invisible reason so many roses fade out by August. You deadheaded faithfully through June, got busy in July, let a few spent blooms sit, and by August the plant has quietly decided the flowering season is over. Deadheading is nothing more than keeping that switch set to keep going. Snick the old flower before it can set a hip, and the balance of the plant's hormones tips back toward the ones that drive new buds instead of seeds. In more months, a fresh flush usually follows about 6 to 8 weeks after you cut. But where you cut matters, and this is the detail the garden centre never explains. Do not just pinch the flower off at the very top. Follow the stem down to the first leaf that has 5 leaflets and faces outward, and cut cleanly just above it, roughly a 1/4 inch up, at a slight angle. Skip the little leaves near the flower that carry only 3 leaflets. Only the leaves with 5 or more sit above a bud eye, strong enough to push a full new bloom, and choosing an outward-facing one sends the new shoot away from the center, which opens the bush up for air and light. 3-leaflet leaflet, weak eye, disappointment. 5-leaflet leaf, strong eye, a real flower. The whole call from spotting the right leaf to making the cut runs about 30 seconds once your eye is trained. On a hybrid tea, you can even just snap the faded head off cleanly with your fingers just below the bloom, which pushes the next one faster than fussing with the shears. Now for the honest counterpoint, because a rule you apply blindly will eventually burn you. In late summer and into fall, deliberately leaving a few spent flowers to form hips becomes a smart thing to do. Those swelling hips send the plant that same slow down message, and this time you want it heard. You want the rose to stop pushing tender new growth and start hardening off for winter. So in the last few weeks before your first frost, ease off the deadheading and let some hips set. As a rule of thumb, stop about 6 weeks out. You feed the seed-making instinct on purpose, right when the season is winding down anyway. And as a bonus, those hips ripen into reds and oranges that carry winter color, and feed the birds. Get the deadheading cut right and the hip timing right, and you have handled one of the biggest reasons a rose quits early. My book, The Flower Gardener's Bible, lays out the full month-by-month calendar for your own zone, $9 at bloomrelay.co. The book cover and the web address are up on your screen now. Time to get down on your knees, because the next reveal is below the soil line, and there is a great deal of bad advice floating around about it. Most grafted roses you buy are 2 plants in one, A named variety on top, the rose you actually chose, joined at a knobby swelling called the bud union to a vigorous rootstock down below that does the growing and the surviving. Growers love a strong rootstock because the roots establish fast and shrug off hard conditions. In the United States, that rootstock is overwhelmingly one variety, an old climber called Dr. Huey, dark red, semi-double, about 15 crimson petals with a flash of gold at the center, and it blooms once in late spring and never again all year. Under stress, that rootstock can send up its own canes, and those canes are hungry. They compete with your named variety, stealing the food and water it needs. And if the grafted top ever weakens and dies, Dr. Huey simply takes over the whole plant. That is why, if you have ever driven past an abandoned farmhouse or an old cemetery and seen a scrappy dark red rose blooming its heart out among the ruins, you were almost certainly looking at Dr. Huey. Those are its ghosts. Somebody planted a beautiful hybrid tea a lifetime ago. The top eventually died, and the rootstock outlived everything around it. There is a quiet irony to it, too. Dr. Huey descends from a wild climber that shrugs off black spot, so the survivor that takes over an old bed is often tougher and healthier than the delicate rose it replaced. Now the critical correction, and it is where the usual advice will steer you wrong. You will read everywhere that you can spot a sucker by counting leaflets, or by leaf color, or by extra thorns. Ignore all of that because it is unreliable. Dr. Huey's glossy foliage often mimics the grafted rose almost exactly, and every rose naturally throws leaves with 5, 7, even 9 leaflets, often with reddish new growth. Leaflet count will fool you. The only reliable test is the point of origin. Trace the questionable cane all the way down to where it emerges from the plant. If it comes up from below the bud union, out of the rootstock, it is a sucker and it has to go. But if it rises from just above the union, off the named variety itself, leave it, protect it, because that is a basal shoot, and a strong basal shoot becomes next season's best flowering wood. I learned that boundary by wrecking it. Early on, dead certain I was being diligent, I tore 3 fat canes off a client's rose because I had decided they were suckers. They came from above the union. They were next year's finest wood, and I had ripped the future out of that plant with my own 2 hands. I still wince at it. So always follow a cane to its source first, and when you do find a true sucker below the union, do not cut it. Dig down, get a grip on it, right where it joins the root, and tear it away, because a torn wound seals over and resists regrowth, while a clean cut just tells the rootstock to send up 2 more, thicker than before. A couple more things worth knowing here. In cold regions, planting the bud union a few inches below the soil line helps keep the rootstock from suckering in the first place, and different regions lean on different rootstocks. Fortuniana down in the hot sandy south, tough multiflora up north. A rose grown on its own roots, an own root rose, cannot sucker at all because there is no separate understock down there to send anything up. And the clearest confirmation of the whole business, the one that removes every doubt, is this. If a single dark red, once blooming rose suddenly appears where your hybrid tea used to be, you are not confused. That is Dr. Huey, and your original rose is already gone. One honest exception before you go tearing at everything in sight. Climbing and rambling roses naturally send up new stems a short distance out from the main plant, so a cane popping up nearby is not automatically a sucker. Watch it, let it bloom, and only pull it if the flower plainly does not match the rose you planted. Back up to the leaves now, because there is a quiet bloom killer that works by robbing the plant a little at a time. Black spot. You know it on sight, the dark, round lesions with fringed, feathery margins that spread across a leaf until it yellows and drops. What gets missed is how tightly it connects to blooming. That fungus needs a specific setup to take hold, at least 7 straight hours of wet leaves paired with warm, muggy nights. And that is exactly what a lot of August gardens hand it, still air and humid darkness. The timing runs opposite to what you would guess. Black spot spreads fastest around the mid-70s and gets held back once the days climb past the mid-80s. The blazing afternoon barely feeds it, but the sticky overnight humidity does. and every leaf you lose to it is a leaf the plant desperately needed. Leaves are the solar panels that fund flowers, so when black spot forces a rose to shed half its foliage, it is starving the plant of the energy that would have gone into blooms. Heavy defoliation can shut down reblooming for the rest of the season, sometimes clear into the following year, and repeated year after year, it can weaken a bush to death. So this one is worth acting on. Water at the base of the plant, never over the top, and do it early in the morning so any splash on the foliage dries off by mid-morning instead of sitting there all night. Pick off the infected leaves as you spot them and carry them out of the garden, away from the bed, and never compost them anywhere near your roses because the fungus overwinters in that fallen litter and on the canes, ready to splash back up onto fresh spring growth. Open the plant up with pruning and spacing so the leaves dry quickly. Choose resistant varieties where you can, and know that the yellow and orange hybrid teas tend to suffer worst, so watch those first. Which brings me to the advice I most want to talk you out of, because well-meaning gardeners reach for it at the worst possible moment. Your rose looks stressed and stalled in the July heat, so you decide it must be hungry, and you feed it. Please don't. A rose in heat-induced dormancy is in survival mode, ticking along on the bare minimum, and shoving fertilizer at it forces out soft, tender new growth that the plant cannot support in that heat, which leaves it more vulnerable, not less. Worse, most of that feed is nitrogen, and nitrogen-driven leaves are the direct expense of flowers, so you buy yourself a flush of floppy green and even fewer blooms. Roses do not need much feeding to begin with. I made this exact mistake as a younger man, tried to rescue a struggling bush with a big scoop of high nitrogen feed in the middle of a heat wave and cooked it into a mess of soft growth that scorched within days. That rose would have been far better off if I had walked away and left it alone. The right time to feed is the cooler fall flush, once the worst of the heat has genuinely broken and the plant is ready to make flowers again. Then a modest feeding, something gentler on the nitrogen, fuels that autumn show beautifully. The nutrients that favor flowers are potassium and phosphorus, not the heavy nitrogen so many garden center feeds pour on. Always water the plant first, feed second, never feed a dry, thirsty rose. And as your first frost draws closer, taper the feeding off, so you are not pushing a wave of soft new growth straight into a freeze that will blacken it. Feed a rose when it is ready to bloom, not when it is fighting to survive. So let me tie the whole walk together, because this is the part I want you to carry out to your own border. That struggling August rose is not failing, and it is not 9 separate errors stacked on top of one another. It is mostly a plant being genuinely smart about heat, quietly protecting itself and waiting for cooler nights, plus a short, honest list of things you can fix. There is a blind cane to snip back to a 5-leaflet leaf, a bald bud to peel, a stuck bud to read as thrips or grey mold, a spent flower to deadhead so the bloom signal stays lit, a rogue dark red cane to trace before you tear, and a black spotted leaf to carry out of the bed. Every one of those you can spot in a slow walk around the plant, and every one takes about 30 seconds to handle once you know what you are looking at. And the finest rose gardeners I know lean into that rhythm instead of fighting it. They know the roses will pull back in the hardest heat and come roaring back when the nights cool, so they plant for it. They pair their roses with late summer perennials, the tall garden phlox, the golden rudbeckia, the hazy blue Russian sage, the ornamental grasses catching the low light, plants that hit their peak in August precisely while the roses are resting. The border never goes empty. It just hands the color off for a few weeks and takes it back in the fall, when those cool nights return and the roses come back deeper, fuller, and more fragrant than they were all summer long. So the next time your August roses go quiet, don't panic and don't reach for the fertilizer. Take the walk, read the plant, do the 2 or 3 small things that genuinely help, and trust the rest to come back on its own, because it will. If a border that carries color from June all the way to frost is what you are after, subscribe, and I will keep meeting you out here at the bed, one problem at a time.